Transnet has welcomed the statement by German software giant SAP, which has absolved the firm of any wrongdoing. SAP released a statement this morning saying the investigations into Gupta-related third-party payments have not revealed any evidence of payments to Transnet and Eskom employees. Transnet says the payments were as a result of a commission agreement between SAP and its suppliers. Transnet says that it feels a sense of relief on behalf of its over 60,000 employees who work hard to ensure the goods chain is run efficiently. And the country's financials came under scrutiny and under the spotlight once again as MPs cast aspersions on Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba's mini-budget speech, but Gigaba gave as good as he got. Gigaba fielded tough questions from members of parliament who wasted no time punching holes into his inaugural mini-budget speech. MPs cast doubt on the maiden budget Gigaba tabled before the Finance Portfolio Committee. MPs insinuated Gigaba was stalling until President Jacob Zuma leaves office and was not acting on the Fees Commission report. However, the minister poured cold water on what he labelled speculation.
Isn't the truth, really, that government is now paralysed, and that what National Treasury and you have done have actually to kick the can down the road, to delay the hard decisions until January or February next year, before the main budget, when you calculate and hope that President Jacob Zuma is no longer the President of South Africa? Is that actually not your strategy?
Government is not paralyzed. And I think one ought not to entertain that perception. Similarly, to suggest, I don't know where that comes from, because it's not ANC policy, that because there is an ANC conference in December, there will therefore be a new president of the country by February. I don't know where that comes from.
Today, UCT was closed down for the next few days. CPUT has been closed down. The University of the Free State has 7 students in jail. This is a major area of policy uncertainty and huge risk. As you yourself have said, it's a high-risk area. So have you actually seen the Haya report, which I believe is over 700 pages long, and maybe this is why President Zuma hasn't released it. Have you seen it? And if so, what do you expect its financial implications to be?
The proposals, the recommendations of the report are being considered. And we will make an announcement in the course before the end of the year on what options are being preferred, on what the report says and what options are being preferred. And in the State of the Nation address and the budget next year, we are going to make a pronouncement on it.
Meanwhile, Malusi Gigaba was quick to admit that the budget didn't strike the right chord with investors and the business community, but it was a step in the right direction under the circumstances.
If somebody says to you, it's raining outside, you can want to be denialist and say that's a very doom and gloom statement because I wanted the sun. The fact is, it's raining. Telling you the fact as it is, opening the books and telling you that here is the situation. We couldn't go and do a comical alley on the nation and tell the nation that things are all fine. And yet they can see that there are difficulties. Boosting confidence is the easiest and quickest stimulus you can have to inject growth in the economy. And that therefore you need to implement to speed up the pace. I repeated this in the statement yesterday several times. Speed up the pace and scale of structural reforms to boost confidence so that you can unlock investments.
And joining us live in studio, Tsepo Khadima, political analyst, and Remo Lisiwa Mulapisi, former South African National NGO Coalition on Budget. He's the former chairperson there. Good evening to you, and thanks so much for your time. With Malusi Gigaba, they're having now to, in a sense, elaborate on what he delivered yesterday, saying that the quickest stimulus to investor confidence is around the structural reform in terms of policy, if I'm reading it correct. Your observation there, Tsepo?
Yeah, I think very interesting comments, taking into account that there were no structural reforms announced in yesterday's medium-term budget policy statement. So I'm not sure as to what he's talking about. And secondly, the so-called investor confidence. I keep asking a question that can somebody define who these investors are? And maybe also it would have been very opportune if by yesterday, during that budget policy statement, there had been full disclosure, which I've been calling on for some time, that full disclosure as to who are the entities that are currently holding South African paper known as a bond. Because whenever they speak about investors, they are speaking about such people. We need to know who they are, and a detailed analysis, a ledger of what interest each and every one of them is accruing to, and more importantly, as to the tenure of that debt. But what we did find out yesterday, in February, there was an announcement that our interest costs for this current financial year and in March will be 169 billion. Yesterday, we were informed that that 169 billion has ballooned by a further 69 billion, therefore bringing our interest payments to well over 240 billion rand for this year alone. So the question becomes, with the revenue collection from taxes revised downwards as a direct result of the increasing unemployment as well as the declining GDP growth, of course that should not have surprised us, but then it means your budget deficit in fact has increased. But when you look at what is the chief source of the budget deficit, is nothing other than our sovereign debt, which for years I have been writing that it needed to be refinanced to reduce the interest costs that we are currently paying, and more so, of course, to also mitigate the currency risk factor. Yesterday, after the budget statement, the medium-term budget policy statement was given, we saw that the so-called investors, they headed for the exit, and they did so fast, and hence the rand, I think, already now is over 14 rand 21 cents by this morning. That we realize. So that decline is simply as a result of that those that were selling were foreigners. Now, what is the next thing to come? Of course, the next thing that has to come is simply a credit downgrade. Now, if you have a government that still believes that deficit financing is the solution against the backdrop of an imminent credit downgrade, you have to be exceedingly worried. And that's why people like myself are exceedingly worried. Fundamental changes needed to have been announced. They were not announced. I spoke about the urgent need to reform the antiquated tax code that we have. That hasn't been touched. Therefore, there is absolutely no way that we are going to see us being able to have a balanced budget. We are going to continue with the budget deficit. The other thing that I spoke about, for example, the volatility of the currency, the question I ask, with China in 2016 having been included in the basket of currencies, the Chinese yuan, or the renminbi, as is also called, that the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland has now incorporated the Chinese yuan or the renminbi. China is our biggest trading partner. I asked yesterday, before the budget was delivered, that will the minister have the gumption to move our trade settlements into alternative currencies, and specifically the Chinese yuan, because the stability of the exchange rate with the Chinese yuan over the last 7 years tells you everything that you need to know about our economy. That wasn't announced. So there were absolutely no structural reforms, and we should not be surprised whatsoever that the rand has responded accordingly. in terms of its exchange rate with the US dollar, and pain is coming to the consumer because we insist on doing our trade settlements, even with our biggest trader being China, still in the US dollar. Then the question has been asked, why on earth are we doing that? So I think we are in for an exceedingly bleak Christmas.
But I mean, the minister obviously doesn't make decisions or even the announcement or in a clandestine fashion. He would consult, there were committees, etc. But if you're saying that these very perennial problems around being over-indebted, the over-reliance on so-called investors, we're not tailor-making solutions that can deal with the unique situation that we have in terms of the social challenges. Remulapis, who is advising the minister? Is there really a paralysis that he's denying or trying to cover?
Look, I mean, the minister has just come in. He's just got into this portfolio just yesterday. So we got to give the break there. But the speech itself is not something new. All the things that he said have been said over a period of time. And as to whether we can manage, we have done it. I mean, when we took over in '94, debt was just high. But we even managed to go to the levels of 5% growth. So I don't think that it's an impossible task. That's what I'm trying to say. But I think we're faced up with real serious problems. Institutional framework, we're in a mess. In terms of state institutions, we're in trouble. You look at what is happening in telecom, Eskom. You look at that, it's in shambles. You look at how in South Africa are we using our own legal resources or legal, how do we use the PMFA, for instance? These are institutions that are given to us to help us drive the economy. Because politics must basically drive the economy. But the link between the two and how we have degenerated in terms of our ethics, in terms of our our moral fiber, and we talk about integrity at the same time. So you can't talk about these things and balance them.
But what I wanted to get to is that you wouldn't have a shortage of volunteers if you wanted to find out what is wrong with the country.
That's for
Thing
sure.
is, if we still do the same exercises and expect different results, is problematic. You're saying this for you sounds like the same script that is just delivered by a different actor. So if where does that leave us if we're continuously going to say appease the investors and we're neglecting to prioritize the needs of South Africans?
No, I think the route is exceedingly clearer now, particularly following yesterday's statement, that we are soon to check into what the Eagles sang about, Hotel California, where you can only check in and there's no check out. And Hotel California, in our case, is the International Monetary Fund. Because we have a South African Reserve Bank that is so in name only, as it's got no reserve, is no longer the lender of last resort. We have a South African bank that has outsourced money supply to greedy profiteering privateers, sometimes calling themselves banks. And as a result, we're not like in the United States. There are others that have argued that, for example, as we speak now, the United States is running at a deficit, a budget deficit, that equates to what, over 119% of its debt to GDP ratio. Now, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio in that case of 119%, you say, why has things not fallen apart? Well, they haven't yet fallen apart. They are about to fall apart, and when they do, it's going to be spectacular in the case of the United States. But what they have been able to do in the meantime, they've been able to print money. We don't have the capacity to do so. So it means, therefore, that our sovereign debt, which we are about to default on, because the assumption, and I don't know what backs up that assumption, is that there is somebody other than this multilateral institution such as the IMF who is going to buy our debt to finance our interest costs that we are not able to afford, which are the chief source of our budget deficit. There is that assumption that somebody somewhere will still have the confidence despite the credit downgrade that is imminent. So the credit downgrade to below investment grade, it simply means that it's going to be much more higher cost of debt. Our existing debt, which now is at 2.5 trillion rand, and I don't know why South Africans are not horrified, if we were to take the debt of this country and divide it equally amongst all men, women, and children who live in this country, it means that each and every one of us now have the wonderful privilege of owing over 45,000 rand per person. That's the reality that we sit with if we are to take our national debt and divide it equally among. So you have to ask that what the minister is saying, that he's looking at a 4.3% in terms of the deficit, that will be funded through further debt. The question is that who is this investor, so-called, who will be willing to buy that piece of paper? And they will do so because in any case they will be making more money, and they will insist, those that are buying in foreign currency, they will insist in buying in dollars, because when you have a corresponding weakness of the rand against the US dollar, the simple situation you sit with is that that so-called foreign investor has got zero currency risk whatsoever. They are completely hedged because your currency is going to weaken. But it brings untold pain and hardship on helpless people who are at home. Now, the point that, well, he's been on the job for a few months, the very first night that this minister was appointed, announced that he's the new minister, I made a point in these very same studios, and I said, I plead with him to go and read a book by Professor Michael Watkins from Harvard University called The First 90 Days. Then it was a very specific reason on why I said that he needed to read that book. Because that book would have equipped him in that first 90 days to have done things that were necessary, no different from the history of the 100 days, which we know out of the Great Depression, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, introduced the 100 days where he asked Congress to accord him powers that would have been given to him as if the United States was in a state of war. And Congress that was fearful gave him all the power to make laws. And I make an example all the time that one of the laws that we sit with in the United States today, that was as a result of the 100 days when power was moved from Capitol Hill into the White House, in terms of lawmaking, was the 1933 Securities Act, which to this day still has a bearing on everyone's lives who has to deal with U.S. securities. So therefore, it means this government, when Malusi Gigaba was appointed Minister of Finance, at that point in time, Parliament needed to have given him power that would have been given to him if we were in a state of war, or at least give it to the president to do what? To do refinancing. But also, on the other hand, is this. One of the fundamental weaknesses in our Constitution, we do not have a debt ceiling. So the Minister of Finance and Treasury, they can go and borrow money and go and mortgage all of us without recourse even to Parliament or even the presidency or in terms of the executive. We do not have a debt ceiling. In the United States, at least, before you can go and rack up further debt, you need to go to Congress and ask for powers to increase the debt ceiling. We don't have a debt ceiling. And I'm asking you a question. These are things that need to have been done in the first 90 days of him being in office. And the more he delays in doing them, the more it means that we are going to have to go to IMF for bailout. And once you're with IMF, no country has ever successfully moved out of an IMF program. And I challenge anybody who can give me a better example. So those are the grave times that we are facing. So if anything, I'm exceedingly... I'm worried beyond imagination.
I mean, and this is intergenerational, as you are saying, that there's a 45,000 rand per capita debt that we carry. And if we don't interrogate it and find newer ways of dealing with the issue of dependency on the International Monetary Fund, we are perpetual economic slaves. You might as well call them our colonizers in an economic sense. So where's the engagement, though? You know, where we can participate, where the minister is not essentially just expected to shadow what his predecessors were doing and can really make meaningful change?
I think we can. I think what this physical consolidation means, it means we must look at our spending pattern. Okay, that's number one. Number two, we must look at, because we are spending on borrowed money, we must be able to service the debt. So if we cap our spending and we reduce that spending, but the question is, where do we reduce? You see, because you cannot go and reduce where people really are dependent on. For instance, your social security cannot be touched at this point in time. So it means you have to make sure that some of the government projects, which are huge, need to either be suspended or they must just be shifted aside in order to make sure that you keep the government spending. You also remember that our debt service is above 4%. In actual fact, the deficit between what we collect and what we spend has gone above 4%. So you want to ensure that you put the brakes there, that you don't go beyond. SEPO has just said the minister can go and borrow us and mortgage us. So that has to be, that has to be stopped. And then the second thing is, where you put your money, ensure that you get the results. We've been putting a lot of money in education, but we don't seem to be getting the results. We're not getting the skills that we require out of that money. We're not really addressing the gaps in the economy, even though we're putting money into education itself. We've got to ensure that we professionalize the bureaucracy, because that's where our implementation is. If you are going to deploy comrades in there who do not have the skills, who do not, and to run these big corporations such as ESCOM and so on, we are running the risk. So if you cannot follow up on what you are spending on in terms of whether you're getting good returns out of it, then you are not investing. You are simply putting money into the economy and you're not really investing. So we need that.
Yeah, is that almost an immediate remedy that can be employed? We know the minister did mention the fact that they're going to trim down on certain projects that are not effective, ensure that there's austerity measures in provincial, national departments, etc., and work around the manufacturing to try and boost job creation. Does he have the leverage right now to make those kind of, to make a meaningful impact in terms of managing our spending and debt?
Yeah, look, I think when you have a desire without a clear plan, I think what yesterday was said is that we somewhat determined what might need to be done, and we know why, but we have not spelled out clearly, or the minister did not spell out clearly, when it's going to be done, by who's going to be having to achieve that. So we don't know that. But what I'm not saying that we should be borrowing money. If anything, I'm one of the biggest critics of the borrowing that we've been binging on, that we should not borrow any further. I'm advocating for refinancing of our debt to decrease, to cut down by more than 50% our interest payments, because right now we have got a raw deal. I'm advocating that you cannot issue guarantees to state-owned companies, and those state-owned companies, they go and borrow money at high interest rates, because the mere fact that they've got a state guarantee, they should therefore be AAA rated and therefore paying the lowest interest rate in history, because there is zero rate of default. Now, one of the things that I would have thought that the minister should have at least come to terms with the experience of South African Airways in terms of the cross default. I am horrified that it is taken as gospel that there can be this thing called cross default, that if one state-owned enterprise defaults, then the rest will be regarded to have been in default. On the other hand, they have not had a better use of the positive cash flows that these entities go and produce. I mean, I spoke at length even about the company that I know very well, Petro SA, that now is in fact even in a negative cash flow situation. It's no longer just in a loss territory as a result of other factors, but it's a negative cash flow situation. But others are in positive cash flow. So did the minister move enough? I'm saying that no, he didn't. There are many things that he could do. There are enough people here that can advise. But for as long as he's got the type of advisors that he has, the type of people he's appointing even to some of these boards, I mean, I'm horrified by some of the decisions he has made on SAA in terms of the incoming board, that those people at the end of the day, I encourage viewers, by the way, to see the interview between Vusi Tembekwayo and Mkondisi Gumede speaking about SAA. Did he move enough? No, he didn't. Is he the person to give us the answers?
We're
I doubt.
going to have to leave it there. And just in fairness, Remo Lapisi, to give you the last word very briefly.
Look, appointing boards is not the remedy. It is just but part of trying to stabilize things. But to get down to the job and do the right thing and get the right people in doing the right job.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thanks indeed to our guest, Sepo Khadima, political analyst, and Mulosiwa Mulapisi is a former South African National NGO Coalition on Budget as their chairperson. We'll take a quick break. We'll see you shortly.